The year was 1682, and something terrible had happened in the mountains of Transylvania. Something so disturbing that 3 bishops rode through snow and ice for weeks to reach Rome. Their horses were exhausted, their faces gaunt from sleepless nights, and in their saddlebags they carried documents that would make the Pope himself tremble. When they finally knelt before His Holiness, their words were barely whispers. They spoke of a church painted entirely black, of rituals that defied everything sacred, and of a secret so dangerous it could shatter the faith of millions. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let me tell you the story they tried so desperately to bury, a story of forbidden knowledge, ancient bloodlines, and a mystery that still echoes through the corridors of the Vatican today. Because what those bishops discovered in that remote Transylvanian village wasn't just heresy, it was proof of something far more unsettling. The Black Church of Brasov stands today as a monument to Gothic architecture, its towering spires reaching toward heaven like stone prayers frozen in time. But this isn't the Black Church our story concerns itself with. No. The church that terrified those bishops in 1682 was smaller, older, and hidden deep in the Carpathian Mountains, where winter winds carry whispers of forgotten names. Picture, if you will, the village of Viskri in the dead of winter. Snow blankets the thatched roofs like burial shrouds, and smoke rises from chimneys in thin, desperate columns. The villagers here speak in hushed tones of the old church on the hill, the one their grandparents warned them never to enter after sunset. They cross themselves when they mention it, and children are forbidden from playing in its shadow. Father Matthias had been the parish priest for over 30 years when the strange occurrences began. He was a simple man who tended his flock with gentle hands and spoke of God's love in sermons that brought tears to weathered faces. But in the autumn of 1681, something changed. Villagers began reporting that the church bells rang at midnight without anyone pulling the ropes. Candles lit themselves in empty pews. And most disturbing of all, the whitewashed walls began to darken, as if some invisible force was painting them with shadows. At first, Father Matthias dismissed these reports as superstition. Mountain folk were prone to seeing devils in every shadow, especially during the long winter months when darkness claimed the land for more hours than light. But then he began experiencing the phenomena himself. He would arrive for morning prayers to find the altar rearranged, with candles forming patterns he didn't recognize. The crucifix above the altar seemed to shift positions overnight, and the walls continued their inexplicable transformation from white to deep, midnight black. The transformation wasn't uniform. It spread like a living thing, creeping across the stone surfaces in organic patterns that seemed to follow some hidden logic. By December, half the church interior had turned the colour of a moonless night, and Father Matthias noticed something even more troubling. The blackened areas weren't just dark, they seemed to absorb light itself, creating pockets of absolute darkness that candles couldn't penetrate. Word of the mysterious church reached the ears of Bishop Corvinus in Cluj, a learned man who had studied at universities in Vienna and Rome. He arrived in Viskri on a bitter January morning, accompanied by 2 other bishops and a small retinue of scholars and scribes. What they found defied every principle of natural philosophy they had learned. The church stood like a wound in the white landscape, its exterior walls now completely black, absorbing the pale winter sunlight until the building seemed to exist in its own pocket of perpetual twilight. But it was the interior that truly shook their faith. The walls weren't simply painted black, they pulsed with an inner darkness that seemed alive. Symbols had appeared across the surfaces, carved as if by invisible hands into stone that had been smooth for centuries. Bishop Corvinus was the first to recognize some of the symbols. His face went pale as he traced their outlines with a trembling finger. These weren't random marks or the products of fevered imagination. They were ancient sigils, older than Christianity itself, predating even the Roman occupation of Dacia. Some belonged to mystery cults that the early church had fought to suppress. Others were completely unknown, their meanings lost to time. But it was what they found beneath the altar that sent the three bishops racing toward Rome. Hidden in a cavity that had somehow opened in solid stone was a collection of documents written on parchment that shouldn't have existed. The ink was fresh, yet the writing style belonged to centuries past. The language was Latin, but not the Latin of church doctrine. This was something older, more primal, filled with references to bloodlines that stretched back to the time of Christ himself. The documents spoke of a secret preserved by a line of guardians, passed down through generations of mountain priests who understood truths too dangerous for the common faithful. They described rituals performed in churches like this one, ceremonies that opened doorways between the world of the living and something beyond. And they contained names, dates, and genealogies that connected this remote Transylvanian village to events that had shaped the very foundations of Christianity. As Bishop Corvinus read by flickering candlelight, his hands shaking not from cold but from terror, he began to understand why the church had turned black. It wasn't corruption or demonic influence. It was transformation. The building itself was becoming something else, responding to the awakening of knowledge that had slept for centuries. The darkness wasn't destroying the sacred space, it was revealing what had always been hidden beneath layers of orthodox doctrine and whitewashed walls. The three bishops spent 5 days in Viscri, documenting everything they found, copying the mysterious documents, and interviewing villagers about their experiences. What emerged was a picture of something far more complex than simple heresy. This was evidence of a parallel tradition within Christianity, one that had survived persecution and suppression by adapting, by hiding in plain sight in remote mountain churches where few questions were asked. Father Matthias himself became a key witness in their investigation. Under careful questioning, he revealed that the changes had begun shortly after he discovered a hidden compartment behind the altar. Inside had been a single book, bound in leather so old it cracked at his touch. The text was written in a script he couldn't read, but somehow, when he looked at the pages, understanding flooded his mind. The book spoke of bloodlines and guardianship, of secrets passed down through chosen families, of a truth about Christ that would reshape everything believers thought they knew. The book contained genealogies that traced certain bloodlines through centuries of carefully arranged marriages and secret alliances. Names appeared that Bishop Corvinus recognized from Vatican archives, families that had held positions of influence within the church hierarchy for generations. But here, in this crumbling manuscript, they were described not as servants of Rome, but as guardians of something far older. As Father Matthias continued his testimony, his voice grew distant, as if he were recalling a dream rather than lived experience. He spoke of nights when the church filled with a presence that wasn't malevolent, but wasn't entirely holy either. The air would grow thick with the scent of frankincense that no one had burned, and shadows would move across the blackened walls in patterns that suggested figures kneeling in prayer, or perhaps supplication to something beyond the Christian pantheon. The villagers had their own stories to tell. Old Maria, whose family had lived in Viscri for 8 generations, remembered her grandmother speaking of the guardians, priests who served a purpose older than the Pope himself. These men weren't rebels against the faith, they were preservers of its deepest mysteries. They understood that truth often required darkness to survive, that sometimes sacred knowledge had to be hidden even from those who claimed to serve God. Young Stefan, barely 16 but already marked by the solemnity that mountain winters carved into men's souls, described visions that came to him in dreams. He saw figures in robes that weren't quite the vestments of any order he recognized, performing ceremonies that felt familiar despite being entirely foreign. In these dreams, the Black Church wasn't a place of corruption, but of revelation, where seekers came to understand truths that daylight faith couldn't accommodate. The most disturbing testimony came from Anna, the village midwife, who had assisted at dozens of births over her 40 years of service. She spoke in whispers of children born during the church's transformation. Infants who seemed to carry some mark of the changes occurring around them. These babies were healthy and normal in every way. Yet something in their eyes suggested an awareness beyond their years. Their mothers reported dreams during pregnancy of ancient ceremonies and bloodlines that stretched back through time like golden threads. Bishop Corvinus found himself facing a crisis of understanding that threatened to shake his very conception of divine truth. The evidence before him suggested not heresy, but hiddenness, not corruption, but preservation. The Black Church wasn't being destroyed by dark forces. It was being revealed as something it had always been, beneath layers of conventional worship and orthodox doctrine. The documents they discovered contained references to other sites across Europe, churches and monasteries, where similar transformations had occurred throughout history. Each location was connected to families whose genealogies intertwined in patterns that suggested careful planning across centuries. These weren't random occurrences, but part of a vast network of preservation, a system designed to protect knowledge that certain individuals deemed too precious and too dangerous for general revelation. As the bishops prepared to depart Viscri, they faced an impossible choice. The evidence demanded investigation, yet investigation would inevitably lead to questions that might tear apart the very foundations of institutional faith. The documents spoke of bloodlines that connected contemporary European nobility to events surrounding the crucifixion itself. They described rituals that predated Christian doctrine, yet seemed to contain its deepest truths. Most troubling of all, they suggested that the Church's greatest mysteries weren't mysteries at all, but carefully guarded facts known to a select few. Father Matthias made one final revelation as the bishops loaded their wagons for the journey to Rome. The book that had triggered the transformation hadn't been hidden by some ancient guardian, it had been placed there by someone still living. 3 months before the changes began, a stranger had arrived in Viscri, a man of indeterminate age who spoke perfect Latin despite claiming to be a simple pilgrim. He had requested permission to pray alone in the church overnight, a request Father Matthias had granted without suspicion. The next morning, the stranger was gone, but something had changed in the sacred space. The air felt different, charged with potential that hadn't been there before. And within weeks, the transformation had begun. This suggested not supernatural intervention, but human agency, the deliberate activation of something that had long lain dormant. The implications were staggering. If the Black Church was the result of human action rather than divine mystery, then someone possessed knowledge of how to trigger such transformations. Someone understood the mechanisms that lay beneath the surface of conventional faith. And if one person possessed such knowledge, then others might as well, scattered across Europe, like seeds waiting for the proper conditions to bloom. As their convoy wound through mountain passes toward Rome, the 3 bishops carried with them evidence that would force the Vatican to confront questions it had spent centuries avoiding. The documents, the testimonies, the genealogies, all pointed toward a truth that could reshape Christianity itself, or destroy it entirely. The choice of how to respond would rest with men whose authority depended on maintaining mysteries that might, in fact, be carefully constructed deceptions. The winter winds that followed them down from the mountains seemed to whisper of other transformations occurring in distant places, other guardians awakening to purposes that had slept since the time of Christ himself. So there you have it, the secret that 3 bishops carried through winter storms to lay before the Pope himself. A story of transformation that couldn't be explained by any doctrine, of knowledge preserved in shadows, and of bloodlines that stretched back through centuries like golden threads connecting past to present. The Vatican's response to their desperate plea remains locked away in archives that few eyes have seen, buried beneath layers of official silence that speak louder than any proclamation. What became of Father Matthias and his blackened church? Some say the building stands still, hidden deep in valleys where maps grow uncertain and compasses spin without direction. Others whisper that it was destroyed, reduced to rubble and salt, its stones scattered to prevent any future awakening. But perhaps the most unsettling possibility is that it continues to exist, patient and dark, waiting for the next seeker to discover truths too dangerous for daylight faith. As sleep claims you tonight, let your mind drift through those Carpathian passes where winter winds still carry whispers of forgotten names. And remember that some secrets are buried not because they're false, but because they're too true to bear. In the space between waking and dreams, where certainty fades like candlelight, perhaps you'll glimpse the shadows of guardians still keeping watch over mysteries that time cannot touch. Sleep well, and let the darkness embrace you gently, for not all shadows are meant to frighten. Some are meant to preserve.